Chapter 27. Jagged Tooth. Willie was the first to move. He sprang from the hole and into the clearing. Sprint blasted off, plowing through the snow. Jack stood and trudged after them. He felt heavy and sluggish in the powdery snow, as if running in a dream. Ahead, he saw Sprint arrive at the slope. He crouched, then ran full tilt, moving effortlessly up the incline. Willie arrived next, squatted, and sprang up the slope in one great bound, disappearing over the crest. Jack reached the base, charging forward. He got a good start, upright at first, then using his paws as the hill steepened. He lost momentum, clawing desperately at the snow, slipping downward, taking a panicked peek over his shoulder. Greenridge came to a stop at the base, his arms stretched like the jaws of some hungry beast. Jack kicked uselessly, sliding closer and closer. Something pink and sticky collided with his shoulder. He was jerked roughly upward, pulled through space like a fish on a hook. The slope passed beneath him in a blur. He flew up over the edge of the hill, then crashed down into the snow. The pink object released his jacket, snapping away quickly and re-entering Willie's open mouth. The frog let out a disgusted groan and swatted at his own tongue. "Don't ever make me do that again," he said, repulsed. "What happened?" Maddie demanded. "Ask Jack," Willie said. Jack felt his cheeks burn. "He was about to kill—" "Guys, can we do this later?" Sprint said. He'd taken Hoover by the crook of his elbow and was leading him toward the open pathway. "We still have another hill to climb, remember?" They passed between the ice cats, crossed the trail, and began up the incline. This hill wasn't as steep, with rocks and trees to aid their progress, and soon enough they were at their snowmobiles. "Let's get out of here before one of those things eats us," Sprint said. "How they gonna eat us?" Willie said, mounting the snowmobile behind Maddie. "They ain't got no heads." "Did you just hear yourself?" Sprint asked as Jack mounted the seat behind him. "They ain't got no heads? How does that make it better?" There was a loud from the hill below, like a blast of compressed air, then the coppery sound of cable unspooling. Turning, Jack looked just in time to see a silver object flying up between the trees. "Look out!" Sprint cried. He and Jack dove off the snowmobile in opposite directions, just as the object crashed into the vehicle's seat. It didn't crush it, but closed around it like a claw in an arcade game. The cable snapped tight, dragging the snowmobile toward the edge of the hill. Jack, who lay between the snowmobile and hill, scrambled to get out from behind it, but the snow beneath him gave way, and he tumbled over the edge. He was somersaulting backward, head over heels. He struggled to stop himself, to roll onto his stomach. The snowmobile was tumbling after him, crashing into the ground every few feet. He slammed into the lower pathway on his side, his head narrowly missing a protruding boulder. The full weight of the snowmobile crashed into the boulder, mere inches above Jack's face. The metal claw slithered through the snow, respooling on its cable until it reconnected with the outstretched front leg of the ice cat. The grizzly had strapped into the pilot seat at the head of the machine.
"After the others,"
he barked, grinning down at Jack from between the cage bars.
"The rabbit's mine."
There was another sound. He'd heard it when they'd arrived. Maybe he'd been hearing it this whole time. It was pronounced now, as if someone had slid the volume up, as if it was beckoning for his attention. It was the cackling sound of water, more specifically, of a river. Unsure of exactly what he was doing, Jack stood on wobbly legs, gained his balance, and bolted toward the sound. It was just beyond the trees ahead, at the U-bend in the path where the first ice cat had stood. The ice cat was gone, after the others, perhaps. He crossed the path, passing between a row of trees. They grew closer together here. He could outstretch his paws and brush the tree on either side of him. They formed a single line, a perimeter on the other side of which Jack came to a sudden, off-balance halt. He stood at the edge of a ravine, looking down at the blue-gray walls of boulders as big as cars. To the right, thousands of gallons spilled over a dam of river-smoothed logs. They seemed to have been piling up here for years, maybe centuries. The water poured over and between them, plummeting into a vaporous cloud that rose up from the ravine to Jack's nostrils. After the fall, the river roared and spat and slammed its fists against jagged rocks and pieces of tree like upturned spears. He was cornered. And then, for the briefest moment, something caught his eye. It had made a movement at the crest of the opposite wall. When he looked again, it was gone. But he could swear he'd seen gleaming green eyes. Crash! The heavy metal claw of the ice cat slammed down behind him, so close that he felt the swoosh of the wind. The arm raised, then slammed down a second time. The ice cat was wedged between the trees, a great metal beast swatting hungrily at its prey, just out of reach. Heart thumping, mind racing, Jack stepped carefully to the edge and looked down. It wasn't scalable, not by someone without experience, or Willie's sticky fingers. Greenridge had withdrawn from the gap. He drove the machine up against the rightmost tree, placing the enormous metal claws against its trunk. The hydraulic whine it made grew louder until it was joined by the creaking and snapping of wood. Bits of bark began to fall from the tree, then the whole thing began to bow toward the river. There was a final crack, then a crescendo of splintering snaps as the tree slowly toppled, nosing into the ravine. Jack threw his arms over his head, although the tree's lower end crashed down several feet to his left. The ice cat mounted the stump, Greenridge's mad eyes fixed on him. He turned toward the ravine. Jumping might not be a more pleasant way to die, but it was a less sure death than waiting on Greenridge. Weak-kneed, he stepped to the edge and peered once more down into the dark chasm. The rocks below were jagged, 1,000 blue-gray teeth waiting for Jack to jump into their maw. Even the mist rising out of the pit looked like icy breath, curling around the downward-sloping body of the fallen tree, which spanned the gap as if pinning the ravine's jaws open. The tree! It sloped downward, its top end folded against the boulders on the opposite wall. He would have to fight the limbs to get across, have to climb the wall once he got there. But it was his best hope, his only hope. He leapt at the trunk, sliding back off on his first attempt. He tried again, this time digging his claws into the bark. He felt the sharp sting of his own weight tugging at his fingertips, but he maintained his grip, struggled upward, and threw an arm over the top. There was a heavy jolt, and he almost slipped back off. The ice cat had mounted the tree, climbing up the splintered end, its metal claws crushing into the bark with vice-like strength. Pushing himself to stand, he adjusted the messenger bag and started down the angled surface of the tree. Balance wasn't difficult. The trunk was broad enough, but the angle was steep, and every step the ice cat took made the tree buckle. He was halfway across now, no longer willing himself to look down. Naked trunk was replaced by branches thicker than his arms, their foliage a dense network of green needles. He thrust himself headfirst into their midst, pushing aside smaller limbs with his outstretched paws. The branches stood so high, so full that once he was deep within them, he could barely see through the darkness and the cloud of mist. Behind him, branches collapsed as the ice cat stomped through them like a plow in tall grass. He quickened pace. Early daylight pressed through the foliage ahead, the stone wall peeking between limbs. The tree rattled heavier than ever. The loud crunching of branches was joined by a low, slow splintering sound. The tree was beginning to give way beneath the ice cat's weight. He swung around the left side of a thick branch, the right side of another. He reached the wall. Black crevices cut between the large boulders, enabling him a hold, first with his paws, then, tentatively, his feet. The sound of compressed air once more, then a metal clank as the ice cat's gripping claw connected with the wall somewhere above him. The cable snapped tight, and a boulder jerked just overhead. It pivoted sideways like a loose tooth. With a final jolt, the boulder was pulled free. It plummeted over his shoulder, nearly clipping him. He lost his grip. The mist enveloped him as he fell, his arms swinging wildly. With an abrupt jerk, he came to a painful halt. It was the ice cat's grappling claw. The strap of his bag had snagged on it, catching Jack by the armpit. He threw his other arm around and hugged the bag, then looked upward. The thick black line of the fallen tree was broken by the ice cat, silhouetted against the faint morning light. It leaned over the side of the tree, its grappling arm outstretched toward Jack.
You're still alive down there?
Greenridge roared, his voice intermingled with the hissing of mist and rapids.
You're luckier than I'd hoped. Have you up in a minute.
The winch whined as Jack began to rise upward, pulled toward the machine like a meal on a dumbwaiter. But the winch stopped suddenly, and Jack began to swing like a pendulum. Hugging his bag tighter, he turned upward to see that some kind of struggle was happening overhead. A second figure had mounted the body of the ice cat, and Greenridge had flung the cage enclosure upward, struggling with one paw to unclasp his restraints while fending off the figure with his other. The wedged tree groaned ominously, sagging visibly under the weight of the machine. Jack looked desperately toward the ravine wall. It was too far to reach, even to jump, and the boulders down here were much larger. He would have a hard time finding a hold. There was a roar. It didn't sound like Greenridge, and a second figure tumbled over the side of the ice cat, catching wildly onto the trunk of the tree with what must have been long, powerful claws. The figure began to scramble toward the machine again, but stopped suddenly and looked downward. From the darkness of a hood, two reflective green eyes peered down at Jack. Changing direction, the figure descended the curved body of the tree, dangling from its underside, then leaping skillfully to the grappling cable. Jack moaned in fear, looking desperately around for anywhere to go. The morning light now illuminated the jagged rocks of the river below, teeth of a frothy monster just waiting for Jack to gain his nerve and jump. But before he could make a move, the hooded figure was on him. He threw a desperate kick, catching the figure in the groin. The figure barked out in pain. "Cut it out, kid! I'm trying to save you!" Jack froze mid-struggle. The face was a lion. A strikingly, impossibly familiar lion. The log sagged further, dropping them another few feet. "It's not going to hold," the lion said. "Move to my back!" Jack threw an arm around the lion's shoulder, awkwardly climbing over him. His fingers felt weak, his elbows wobbling with delayed shock. He wrapped his arms around the neck, clasping his paws together. The lion kicked his legs forward, then back, then forward again. After a few attempts, they began to swing. He pushed forward, back, forward, back. They were swinging wide now, the mist wisping around Jack's face. They arched backward. The lion's muscles tightened at the top of the swing. "Hold on tight!" he yelled. He kicked his legs forward again. They swung quickly through the mist. The lion pulled upward, pounced, released the cable. They flew through the air. With a sudden, final jolt, they slammed against the far wall of the ravine, the lion's thick black claws digging into the surface, struggling for purchase. There was a loud crack overhead. Greenridge roared. The sound was angry and afraid, and for a wild moment Jack imagined a bear flying through the air toward them. But as the two halves of the tree fell, they clapped together like the jaws of an enormous crocodile, crushing the ice cap between them. There was a final splashing, crashing, metal-rending explosion of sound. Jack turned in time to watch the limp limbs of the ice cat tumble away down the river. There was silence for a moment. Relative silence, the kind where the growling river and fizzing mist were like the white noise of a television that had lost its signal. And then there was a crack like a gunshot. Something heavy and black shot past, just over their heads. The lion looked upward, then turned his head sharply to the right. Jack, following his gaze, saw the towering face of the waterfall, its countless logs piled high above their heads. But at one spot, just above them, water gushed outward from a gap between logs, like a child's missing tooth. The dam began to moan, 1,000 voices groaning in protest. Then a plunking sound as several logs shifted suddenly, ominously forward. The lion turned upward once more. Jack followed his gaze again. Halfway up the ravine wall, a gap was left where Greenridge had dislodged the boulder. With surprising strength and agility, the lion began paw over paw up the wall. The logs groaned louder. Water spat through wounds opening in the dam face. They were nearly there. Up and up. Only a few stones left. Another gunshot crack. A log flew just below their feet, connecting with the wall, taking a chunk of stone with it. The lion roared, a deep wildcat roar. He lunged, threw his arms into the open gap, struggled upward. 2 more loud cracks, then 3, 4. Then, as Jack was pulled up and into the muddy-smelling crevice, there began a chorus of plunking, crashing, thudding, and banging. The dam gave way completely. Endless logs tumbled past them, shutting them into momentary darkness.